Do you want to create an AI-powered code generator and Python interpreter? If the answer is yes, then this video is for you. By the end of this video, you will know how to create a code generator which produces Python code, and at the same time, we're also going to create a Python interpreter which lets you run the code instantly. So let's move on to the actual coding part. So first things first, we need to create a new project in PyCharm. So I've already created a project called AI Code Writer Demo, and currently this project is completely empty. So let's create a new file, which is called application or just app. And this will be the entry point of our application. We also need to create two different directories. So one of them will be used to store the actual templates, and the other one will store all the static files that we might have, like CSS or JavaScript. So the first folder will be called templates, and then the second one will be called static. So let's go back to the app.py file, and here what we want to do is we want to start coding. So we are going to use Flask, and so the reason why we use Flask is because we want to create a web page where users can actually enter a prompt, and then based on that prompt, it's going to generate some Python code, and then there will be an option to run the code and see the actual result. So let's import Flask, render template, request, and maybe JSONify. So we also need to install this package before we actually run the application. And we also want to import OpenAI, because we're going to use OpenAI to generate code. And we need to import the system library and maybe the IO library. So we also need to install OpenAI. So let's go ahead and do that. And we can move on to creating the actual Flask application. All right, and let's just create a main function so that we can run this Python application. So now that we have defined the main function, we can go ahead with creating a few helper functions that will be used to generate Python code, query OpenAI, and then basically take the user input and pass this onto the application. So the first function that we want to create is probably generate code. So this function is going to take a prompt as an input, and it's going to basically pass this prompt to OpenAI. So let's assume that we have a client, and then we want to query OpenAI. So in this case, we want to query the GPT-4o mini model, and we want to pass two messages. So one of them will be the system message, and the other one will be the user message. So the first one will basically be the system, and we can say that we want this to be like an expert programmer, so that OpenAI knows that we want it to write some good quality code. So we can say you're an expert Python programmer, and we can actually just duplicate this line, and we can say that this is the user. And yeah, so in here what we need to say is we can say write a Python function based on the prompt. So the prompt in this case is just the prompt variable. And what we also want to do is we want to say that we just need to include the code and a docstring so that it tells us how it works and what it does. So let's say that we don't need any other explanation because, you know, sometimes OpenAI can come back with a lot of information. In some cases, this might not be necessary. And yeah, so let's just swap this for double quotes because we want to use the single quotes here. So what we want to say is basically don't include quotes and the language name. So I've noticed that if you ask OpenAI to write some code, it's going to put the function into quotes, and then it's going to basically list the language that this function was written in. And finally, what we can say is we can say add a sample function call and a print statement. So this is just to give the user an idea on how to run the function. And yeah, so that's pretty much this function, I guess. We want to create this client, so let's just add an exception to say client is none. So we want to set the client here at the top. So the reason why we create this client dynamically is because we want to be able to pass our key for OpenAI, and then basically based on that key, it's going to create a client. And yeah, so once we have the response, then what we want to do is we want to return basically the actual function that was written by OpenAI. Okay, so we can move on to creating the next function, which will be execute code. So execute code will be responsible for running the actual function. So we can wrap this into try and accept just to make sure that when something fails, like when a function fails, then we get the actual exception message so that users are aware of what went wrong. And yeah, so let's use the system output. So okay, and then we need to set this to a string, the input stream. And yeah, so now what we want to do is we want to execute the actual code. So how do we do this? So we pass the quote, and then it doesn't take any arguments as an input. And yeah, what we want to do is we want to get the actual output from the system output. So how do we do this? So we need to say get value, and yeah, so now we need to change the reference to the old. Basically, we want to reset the output, and finally we want to return this to the user. Yeah, so just to make sure that we've got everything. So this function is basically responsible for executing the code and returning the result back to the user. And yeah, so we've got these two functions. I guess the next step is to create two endpoints. One of them will be the index endpoint. So this is the endpoint that will be basically rendered when the user accesses the main page of the application. So let's just go ahead and create this root. So this will be the index, and we want to say that we want to render the index page. So we're going to create this index page shortly. And what we want to create on top of this is basically we need to create another root, which will be called generate. And yeah, so this will be responsible for generating Python code. And we also want to create another root, which will be execute. And as the name suggests, the execute will be used for running the code. So let's go ahead and actually add some data, basically logic for the generate endpoint. So let's do that. So let's assume that this will take JSON input. And yeah, so this JSON input is going to contain the prompt that the user passed in. And yeah, so the prompt can also be empty. In this case, we need to have some sort of error handling logic. And we want to get the API key, which will be entered by the user. And yeah, so now we can add some exception handling just to make sure that the user has provided all the necessary arguments. So if we don't have a prompt, then what we can do is we can basically return an error message, and we can say prompt cannot be empty. And what we want to do is we also want to return status 400. And now we can copy this and add something similar for the API key. So what we can say is basically OpenAI key is required. And yeah, so if the user has passed a prompt and an API key, what we want to do now is we want to reference the client. So we want to create a new client, which is basically a global variable. And we can add a check to say if the client is not set, then what we can do is we can basically create a new OpenAI client. So let's go ahead and do this. And yeah, so this takes the API key as an input. And once we have the client, then what we can do is basically we can ask OpenAI to generate code based on the prompt that the user has entered. And we can just return this code and visualize it into some sort of a text box, which we're going to create very soon. So let's say that this will be the code. And yeah, so this endpoint is ready. So I guess we need to change the request. So basically this will be post request because we're actually sending data to this endpoint. So it cannot be a get request. I mean, it can be a get request, but it's easier to do it with post, and usually you use post when you're sending data rather than using get. And we also need to modify the execute function. So the execute function is going to be a post function as well, and it will be responsible for executing the code. So let's do something similar as to what we did for the generate function. So we get the data from the JSON request, and then what we need to do is we want to get the code, and And yeah, so we can add a validation to say if there's no code, then we want to return some error message. Let's modify this message. So what we can say is we can say no code provided. And after this, what we want to do is we want to run the actual code. So we can just make a function call to the function execute code, and then we can pass the code that we've received as an input. And finally, we want to return the actual output of running the code. So we can say output. And yeah, so now I believe we should have all the Python functionality to basically generate code, execute the code, and return the output to the users. So what we need to do next is we want to create an index page, and we want to create the actual UI where the users can enter their API key, they can see the code generation, and they will have an option to run the code. So let's create the index page. Okay, so this is basically the index page. So I've added title, and then we're also going to use a static file for the CSS styling. So we're going to create this next. And yeah, so just to give you a quick overview, so we have one container in here, and then it contains most of the options that the users can play with. So there will be an option to basically for the users to add their API key. Basically, this will be an input text box which they can go to and copy, basically paste their OpenAI key. And there will be a text area where they can write the prompt, and also there will be a button for generating code. So basically when the users enter the prompt and click the button generate code, then the generated code is going to appear into the next field. And yeah, so there will be an option to execute the code. So this is another button. And finally, this will be the output of the executed code. So let's go ahead and create styles.css and script.js. Okay, so this is how styles.css looks. So this is just the styling of the actual UI. So I'm not going to go through all the details, but yeah, so we've got the body, the container, then we've got the input and the text area. This is another container for storing the text, and then there's some styling for the buttons. And yeah, so let's go ahead and create script.js. So this file will be basically responsible for making the connection between the UI and the Python backend. Yep, so this is how script.js looks. So there will be like a few functions. So let's just focus on the actual functional bit. So there will be a function called generate code. So what this is doing is basically collecting the user input from the UI, and what it's doing is basically it's querying the backend, so it's hitting the generate endpoint which we defined a moment ago, and it's passing the API key and the prompt as an input. Finally, it's retrieving the response, like the actual data, the actual code, and it's adding this to the output text box. And there is another function which is called execute code. So this one is responsible for getting the code that was generated from the previous step, and it's responsible for hitting the execute endpoint. So the execute endpoint is basically something that we defined earlier, and this endpoint is responsible for executing the code. And as you can see here, the body of this fetch function is the actual code. And yeah, so again, we're just getting the response. And finally, we're visualizing the output into the text box. So I believe at this point we've got everything. And what we can do is basically we can go ahead and run this application. Okay, so the application is up and running. So you can see it's running on our local host. So if you just click on this URL, yeah, there you go. So this is the index page that we created just a moment ago. So you can see there is a section where you can enter your OpenAI key. There is another section where you can enter the prompt. And finally, there will be two other sections for generating the code and executing it. So let's quickly test this and see how it works. So this is my own OpenAI key. And yeah, let's go ahead and enter a prompt. So let's say uh, how to add two numbers. And yeah, just press the button, generate code. And as you can see, it generated a Python function that is responsible for adding two numbers. So you can see there is a docstring, which tells you exactly how this works. And finally, you've got a sample function with a print statement. And if we want to run this entire block of code, what we need to do is we just need to press run code. And as you can see, the output is 8. So the reason for that is we're running 5 and 3. So you can also ask the program to write complex functions for you, and it's definitely going to do that. So let's say, can you solve the fizzbuzz problem? So the fizzbuzz problem is a common exercise that's basically used during the interview process of software engineers. And basically it's checking if a number is divisible by 3 and 5, and then basically if one of them is divisible by 3, the other one is divisible by 5, or if a number is divisible by both 3 and 5, then we print different words. So you can see you've got a precise explanation how it works. And yeah, so this is fizzbuzz 15. So in this case, I believe it should print fizzbuzz because 15 is divisible by 3 and 5. So, okay, oh, this is actually printing all the numbers from 1 to 15, and then it's checking if each number is divisible by 3 or 5 or both 3 and 5, and then it's printing the output. So you can see 5 is divisible by 5, so we've got buzz, then 6 is divisible by 3, and we've got fizz, and so on. And yeah, so that's pretty much the end of this video. So I hope that you found this useful. And if you did, please like the video, subscribe to the channel. And if you want to get the full code behind this video, you can join my school community. The link should be down below in the description. And yeah, see you in the next video.